gentlemen, we are here to launch a set of books and a set of values in our own law school. So my role here is only to be the host of this launch. I have nothing to say in addition to the fact that we are glad that the Americans finally came. We waited for them for so long that we never thought they will come. Now they landed. So we are very interested in hearing what they have to say and what us Romanians understand from what they are saying. And this is even more interesting even for them who know what they said, but they will be interested to understand what we are understanding from what they are saying. And it's very interesting that just a couple of hours ago in this same very room there was a launch of a book dealing with the last 30 years of democracy in Romania and the role of the Constitutional Court, our own Supreme Court, in making the democracy go forward. This being said, I will start by passing the word to Professor Aligică, who will discuss more about the philosophy contained in these books. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the chance of being in a sense, the one who is setting the stage for this conversation. And I'd like to emphasize from the very beginning that this event is designed as a conversation. Before saying a couple of things on the substance of things, I'd like to say a couple of things about how we are going to proceed. So most probably, most of you haven't seen or just get a glance of the structure of the program. And I'm going to outline it just for you to get a sense where we are going, and where we'd like to be in a couple of hours at the end of this conversation. So we'll be starting with a discussion about the two books published by us in Romania today, but having the privilege of having the authors with us today at this book launching. So we'll be seeing the first segment of this conversation mostly as a setting up the stage for the second part of the conversation, which would be initially a discussion between these authors around a couple of very interesting and important topics that I'm going to elaborate a little bit later in my brief presentation, follow up by a conversation open with the public based on the initial points, remarks, observations made by the authors. So this is what is ahead for us for the next couple of hours. And my hope is that what is going to happen would be interesting, significant, and at the end of these 2 hours, we'll be better positioned to understand not only the substance of the topics dealt with in these books, but also the relevance of those topics for issues of a political nature, social nature, cultural nature, which, in a sense, are major challenges to us these days. So, this is the agenda ahead. My next point. So, my next point is just, in addition to welcome you to the University of Bucharest, to the Faculty of Law, and to the Research Center, which is focused on normative analysis and natural law, to give you a couple of reference points regarding the nature of the institutional setting of this conversation. Mostly the center itself and the project of the center. And with that, you'll see within the logic of the project of the center where these translations and where these authors are situated. Obviously, at the end, I'm going to say a couple of things about the authors, but by that time, I hope it would be very clear why we have decided at this point to bring them into the context of our Romanian conversation. So my hope is that be done with everything that I have mentioned in the next 7 minutes or so. In the context of Romanian history, or if you want, Romanian civilization, usually when you create an institution, an organization, you look to the West and you consider that that institution is an effort to catch up with the West or to diffuse an institution and to create a structure in order to bring Romania at the level or close behind the Western standards. This is not the case with this center. And I'm going to remind you, this is a center which is focused on the study of natural law and normative analysis. This center is, in a sense, part of a global reaction to the current crisis, institutional crisis, intellectual crisis, political crisis, governance structure crisis, economic crisis, and very soon probably geopolitical crisis, which the Western civilization and the global civilization is challenged with at this point. And the basic assumption is that these crises that we are seeing unfolding in front of our eyes should have, must have, an intellectual, philosophical, and theological foundation. It is impossible to have a situation of such a magnitude without finding, in the end, the foundations which have something to do with political ideas, philosophical ideas, ethical ideas, theological ideas of those societies which are in crisis. And the thesis, the hypothesis on which a center like this one is building its strategy, approach, and structure is that the current crisis, which again, it's a global crisis, has something to do with the idea that we could build institutions, societies, economies, somehow forgetting that the structure of the universe, the structure of society, the structure of human interactions is defined by some patterns, by some regularities, which define what is possible and what is not possible, what is feasible and what is not feasible, and even more controversial, what is wrong and what is right. So you see, if you are looking and you are defining things this way, very soon you'll discover that people in the past were thinking about these things, which is to say the harmony between human institutions and human nature and the structure of the universe, the visible and invisible structure of the universe, in terms of natural laws, natural law. So, the first hypothesis is that, and the most important in such an enterprise, is that we have to go back and we have to investigate, right, these issues. Are there such structures, like the natural law, out there defining the relationship between individuals and the structures of communities and societies? So, Center for Natural Law. Normative analysis. We have gone through a long period in which we thought that science and identifying the scientific structure of the universe is sufficient in order to build up efficient institutions and societies. It might be the case that in addition to the positive law, there are aspects of a normative nature which are defining this universe, these societies, and that we need to have a science of norms, of normativity, of ethics and politics, which is as developed and as important as the science of physics or chemistry. So you see, in a sense, the way an organization like this one is trying to respond to this crisis. It's not so much an attempt to catch up with the West, in the tradition of this science or that, but it's an attempt on our own terms here in Eastern Europe and in Romania to respond to the crisis of our times and try to rediscover the foundations of social order. Now, from now on, my task is very simple. You understand why we want to bring here scholars which are very significant in the tradition of exploring these issues. And here we have the scholars. Also, we didn't simply want to have the scholars brought here to Bucharest without providing for the Romanian public a selection of their works, which is precisely what we have done. So these books are selections of their works, 4 or 5 essays, which give you a sense of their views on these things. We have translated them, and we have provided them for the Romanian public. But moreover, we wanted, when launching these translations, to have the privilege of having the authors with us. So I'd like to thank them for accepting our invitation. And again, I would like to thank the University of Bucharest for providing the setting for the event and providing the institutional infrastructure for creating the center. I would like also to thank the Faculty of Law at the University of Bucharest, which is basically the most important institutional anchor for this, setting. And also I would like to thank to the people who were involved from the very beginning, from the University of Bucharest, in building up this center, and who are at this point the people who are leading up this effort. And among them, I would like to thank Professor Valeriu Stoica, who is the president and the coordinator of this enterprise. So, without further ado, I'm going to say just briefly a couple of things about these 3 authors, and then in the conversation and in the rest of our discussion, you'll get a better sense of the content and the differences between their approaches. We are going to talk more about that. Next to me is Professor Bradley from Notre Dame University, who has a very impressive background, both in terms of doing what we say applied work in philosophy or social sciences, right? And as a scholar. Then Douglas Rasmussen, St. John University in New York. Let me say that we have here natural law represented next to me, Professor Bradley, in the St. Thomas tradition, correct? Natural law with Professor Doug Rasmussen in the Aristotelian tradition. The same thing with Professor Denial, with Dr. Denial, who for many years was involved and continues to be involved with Liberty Fund, the preeminent institution dealing with the tradition of freedom in the Western civilization and in general, keeping up to date the books, the translations, the library, and the intellectual ideas which are defining the classical liberal and in general the tradition of freedom and democracy. So that being said, I think that I have provided the transition from the previous event to the new event happening. I think that I have set up the stage to understand better the institutional background of the event. The book series, I think I have said a couple of things about it, so you understand why we are translating these kind of books, the authors, and with that, I think that we are moving to the next stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Elicica. This being said, we will now try to make a swift turn into the merits of the debate today. And first of all, we will try to show the way the Romanian authors who wrote the foreword for these books looked at these books. The forewords were drafted by Romanian scholars, so we will start first of all with Professor Mircea Dumitru, member of the Romanian Academy, to present his views on the book by the 2 Douglases, which is called Liberalism, Perfectionism, and Natural Rights. And you know, it's very interesting that the Romanian editor chose to start with liberalism in the title of this collection of essays. Because liberalism, I think, and I'm not a specialist, is the most misunderstood term when debating Romania or Eastern Europe, or even Europe and US traditions. Because in Europe, and more specifically in Romania, where liberty and freedom are homonyms, they are both using the same word, libertate, the same word that was the first cry of the Romanian Revolution in December 1989. Liberalism means one thing. On the other side of the ocean has some sort of a totally different meaning. So, Professor Dumitru, please just give us a glimpse of what these essays are about. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Izoio, and thank you for having me, and thank you for being this evening here. And most of all, thank you, professors, for coming such a long way to Bucharest and sharing with us your vision, your works, and why not your philosophies about these very important issues. So Professor Stoica invited me to write an introduction to this book of essays by Douglas Denial and Douglas Rasmussen, which I did, and I enjoyed it very much. I have a very, very long presentation of the essays, so in the 15-minute time that I'm having now, it's practically impossible to summarize everything. This is why I'm going to touch upon some things that I believe are very important, especially coming from philosophy and expanding the discussion to the foundations of law. As a matter of fact, the two authors are very distinguished philosophers in the States. They combine in a sort of unique way the tradition, the new Aristotelian tradition, the use naturalism tradition, and also, since this is actually the stage in the States, it's also the analytic way of doing things, analytic philosophy, which is the way of doing philosophy in the United States. I also have to acknowledge and to thank Teodora Nikita, who is a PhD student. Her supervisor is Professor Stoica, because she is actually the author for the Romanian public, because she translated the essays into Romanian. Now, for all of you who didn't have the chance to look even very briefly to the book, let me tell you which are the 4 essays that we selected for this edition, the Romanian translation. We have individual rights and human flourishing, liberalism in retreat, ethical individualism, natural law and the primacy of natural rights, and last but not least, the perfectionist turn, which is, in a matter of fact, is my intervention is about this, because I find that this is extremely challenging and extremely important to understand this way of doing philosophical foundations of ethics and of law. I'm going to stick to the time, so bear with me for, let's say 13 minutes from now. Now, the question of the foundation of value, we know that has preoccupied moral philosophers for thousands of years, and the Aristotelian ethical tradition provides a very simple and straightforward answer: nature. Of course, now, for philosophers, the task, the issue is how to disambiguate and how to explain this concept. Now, this answer, this Aristotelian answer, does not exclude other elements, such as reason, tradition, or authority, but evaluates them according to what they are in their own nature, their own essence. A naturalistic standard of value assumes choice, finality, and self-direction, making means such as reason, tradition, and authority contribute to the fulfillment of our nature. In the neo-Aristotelian paradigm, that is mainly the paradigm of the essays, what is considered to be reasonable, authoritative, and socially appropriate must ultimately be assessed against this naturalistic standard of value. However, the essay The Perfectionist Turn does not demonstrate the superiority of the perfectionist paradigm and does not test it in any concrete way in the development of our value judgments. In this essay, Denial and Rasmussen explore in a sort of very rigorous, very accurate way, following in Rawls's footsteps, the concept of perfectionism, which suggests that human good is linked to the realization of individual potentials. Some criticisms are examined, however, of the idea that the act of realizing potentialities does not necessarily imply value for the individual, or of the idea that there is a gap between human good and personal flourishing or fulfillment. The key question is why being good as a human being should be the normative standard for a person. The authors propose the idea of individualistic perfectionism, which argues that human flourishing is relative and individualized for each person, not determined by social conventions or subjective desires. Individualistic perfectionism emphasizes the cultivation of moral virtues and practical wisdom in order to achieve a self-fulfilling life. Human life is considered central to this view, expressing both the generic and individual characteristics of human nature. Denial and Rasmussen aim to argue in favor of a traditional conception of perfectionism, which has its basis in the perfection of human nature, but they redefine it through the prism of individualistic perfectionism. And in this way, they attempt to address the criticism of perfectionism and to outline a more contemporary perspective of human flourishing, which we know that is coming from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. A related theme that the two authors address is that of examining perfectionism in comparison to the concept of human flourishing or fulfillment. And here, Denial and Rasmussen criticize perfectionism for not taking into account the context in which excellent activities take place and not explaining the link between the development of human capabilities and the achievement of human goals. They argue that perfectionism can lead to a standardized approach to excellence that can ignore individual needs and aspirations. The authors believe that perfectionism needs to take into account the individual context and recognize that excellence and achievement can be achieved through a variety of pathways tailored to individual needs and circumstances. And in particular, this is something very important for our contemporary age, in which we know that we cannot strive for very, very general, unique standards. The authors examine the concept of perfectionist individualism, which argues that human excellence is linked to the development of human capabilities in an individualized and practical context in which balance and the middle way, as it were, to personal fulfillment are found. They debate the concept of internal coherence of well-being, welfare internalism, versus external coherence of well-being, welfare externalism. Internalism, according to the author, refers to the fact that happiness depends solely on a person's individual characteristics, while externalism implies external factors that can influence happiness. The authors argue that both perspectives need to be considered and that human happiness can be influenced by genetic and individual capabilities as well as social and cultural circumstances. This also raises the problem of perfectionism, which is the difficulty of defining precisely what perfection means and of formulating universal standards of happiness for all people. The author suggests that it is important to avoid perfectionism and accept individual diversity in the pursuit of happiness and fulfillment. In the conclusion of this section from the essay, the authors argue that we need to have a comprehensive ethical perspective that considers both generic and individual aspects of human nature. Happiness and fulfillment are subjective and can be influenced by multiple factors. And the normative approach should be more open and flexible to allow for a diversity of ways to achieve personal happiness and fulfillment. Next, Denial and Rasmussen discuss different perspectives on human nature and associated ethical concepts, particularly in relation to human happiness and fulfillment. The argument starts from the distinction between primary nature and secondary nature and focuses on how those concepts influence ethics and moral norms. It points out that facts about human nature, primary nature, are not simple and devoid of ethical implications, but are always evaluated in a normative and ethical concepts, which is the secondary nature. The teleological perspective, which considers the realization of human capacities for happiness and fulfillment, is considered more relevant than the one that emphasizes primary nature. It is argued that teleology is necessary to understand human happiness and fulfillment, and that capacities must be exercised and evaluated in a normative and ethical context. Thus, any discussion of human nature, which is of the essence of this tradition in philosophy, the jus naturalis tradition, and ethics ultimately involves an appeal to teleology and an evaluation of human capacities for fulfillment and happiness. It is also pointed out that an exhaustive approach to being a good person implies an understanding of both generic and individualizing characteristics, and that the separation between being good and one's own good is only apparent and does not imply a real separation. Overall, this part of the essay explores how human nature, teleology, and ethical norms are interconnected and how our perception influences the question of human happiness and fulfillment. Now, to conclude my short intervention on the value of the jus naturalis vision outlined by all the studies, not only by the study that I actually very, very briefly summarized in this volume, and also in relation to the importance of Denial's and Rasmussen's research for the development of contemporary philosophy of law, it is important to note how the understanding of human fulfillment and the role of natural rights in contemporary politics and ethics is examined and assessed and valued. Both the theological natural law tradition and the more contemporary secular, humanistic, as they say, natural law tradition have solid grounds in arguing that human fulfillment is not an atomistic phenomenon. That is, individuals taken by themselves cannot achieve in isolation without regard to society and other people. In line with the well-known Aristotelian contention, the authors argue that humanity has a social, relational nature, and that human fulfillment is a relational phenomenon that requires connections with other people and the sharing of common values. However, they recognize that these shared values should not be imposed, but should be freely chosen by individuals. Thus, the authors argue that there must be a common good that goes beyond the individual good, and that can be achieved through individual choice and self-direction. Both authors stress the importance of the concept of self-direction in human fulfillment, and that natural rights are designed to protect this capacity for individual self-determination. Natural rights are not directly aimed at maximizing human fulfillment, but at providing the conditions for each individual to reach his or her own potential for fulfillment. In this context, Denial and Rasmussen raised the political problem of liberalism, which is how to ensure a political/legal order that allows different forms of individual fulfillment to coexist with moral conflict. Natural rights, understood as meta-norms that protect the possibility of self-direction, offer a solution to this problem. They aim to ensure a sphere of freedom for each individual in which they can act according to their own values and reach their potential for fulfillment without infringing on the freedom of others. In conclusion, the authors argue that natural rights represent an improvement on traditional natural law perspectives because they explicitly address the problem of liberalism and offer a solution that is based on respecting and protecting the individual's capacity for self-direction within a morally pluralistic society. Denial and Rasmussen point out that natural law theory and the natural rights tradition have sometimes diverged, but also overlapped. Both oppose philosophical trends that affected modern political and social theories, such as historicism, conventionalism, and mostly relativism. In their studies, the authors have tried to strike a balance between the two traditions, adopting the moderate realist aspects of the natural rights tradition. They recognized that their position differs from other doctrines, especially those that give politics a central role in moral life. Their perspective does not involve politics in moral fulfillment and can therefore be seen as outside both traditions. Finally, Denial and Rasmussen point out that there are interesting questions about the sources of tension between the two traditions and show us ways of their possible reconciliation. These questions remain open, and the two philosophers offer some suggestions for a possible answer, suggesting that a reconciliation should involve an updated Aristotelianism that embraces moderate realism and values moral individualism. Thus, the conclusion they reach bring into question the key aspects of their argument and emphasize the importance of finding a balance between the two philosophical traditions without neglecting the relevant challenges and questions that remain open for the future. This is why I'm saying, as a final assessment, that the present volume shows that what is alive in the philosophical tradition, namely the doctrine of natural law of Aristotelian origin, and it is a convincing demonstration of the power of philosophy to determine and influence reasoned and informed rational choices in ethics, in public policy, and not least in the ways in which we hold our political views in relation to reflected public and social relational life, the only life worth living. Now, if I may add just a word about what actually struck me after I read the essays and while I was writing the introduction. And that's something that it was quite unexpected to me. Many years ago, I translated into Romanian Nozick's Anarchy, State and Utopia. And I wrote a long introduction to that translation of mine. That was way back in 1998, I guess. And I was expecting to find, of course, many things that connect the views of Denial and Rasmussen with the framework that Nozick is using. But currently, I'm not working in that field. And I was afraid that I cannot contribute something writing my preface to your book in Romanian. What I'm writing now is something in metaphysics, philosophy of language, and philosophical logic, which starts with a vision about semantic relationism. The idea that meanings of utterances, and more generally, properties that we attribute to individuals, are not sufficient to understand the ontology of our world, and that the relations between the individuals are as important as attributing properties to individuals. And this kind of relationism that you brought out in your perspective about ethics, law, about use naturalism, is something that is now very important for me because I see a sort of pattern and system into all this, connecting the research in the foundation of ethics and philosophy of law with what we are doing in philosophical logic and metaphysics. And that is a homework that I take with me.
Thank you. Now we continue with the Romanian views on the American authors with Dr. Tudor Avrigeanu, head of the Public Law Department within the Institute of Legal Research of the Romanian Academy, who will talk us about his view on those essays on law, religion, and morality that Professor Gerald Bradley put together. And as a professor of civil law myself, I always asked why there is a text in our civil code, in our civil law, saying that any contract should obey to the good morals. But I know this is not the point right here. Mr. Avrigeanu, please.
Thank you, Professor Risoio. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I assume that my best possible thank for being here would be to keep my intervention limited. I do not intend to speak longer than 15 minutes. It will be perhaps better to speak even shorter, because I have, and I'm very sincere, I'm speaking this very sincerely, I have no exercise of the English language. I think this is the first time since years for me to speak English, and that's why I do not want to let you all sing what I don't know, an aria of Mozart, Macht an alle Arten, Magic Flute. I will start my intervention from the end of the previous one. The importance of the relations, of the definition of the man as relational being. We know Zoon Politikon, and we say it also in Romanian, we use to translate this definition as social being, man being a social being. Well, I would propose you another translation which even sounds literally more adequate. Man as political being, which is Zoon Politikon. Where is the difference? The difference had once Bernard Wilms, an ancient vice president of the International Thomas Hobbes Association, and he said the definition, the correct translation of the definition of the man as political being should render us attentive to the fact that the human flourishment, as Aristotle says, is possible, is not only possible, it culminates within the polis. Bernard Wilms was a German, and for him was the polis, the translation, the modern translation of the polis, der Staat, the state. The state not as general political form of history, as if we would speak of the Roman state in the antiquity, but specific political form of the modern times. Well, and now I will go back to Aristotle and human flourishing, and I will come closer to the works of Professor Bradley. And I would start not with these essays, but I will call to the memory of those from you who had perhaps read this book, Professor Bradley's short but so marvelous Student's Guide to Law. There are really marvelous pages about the importance of the friendship within a society, even if this friendship can and must not be translated further in legal concepts. A society which founds only on law and nothing more, in this way I understood Professor Bradley, such a society without basic friendship is not a viable society. Well, there is not only friendship in our societies, in societies which have to do with the political, whose criterion no other is than the distinction between friend and foe or enemy. We all in America, as well as in Europe and in Romania, speak permanently about cultural wars. And Professor Bradley takes this issue very seriously. His, if I correct, last book, Unquiet Americans, is precisely about a cultural war within the American society where the Catholic citizens of the United States are called to defend what? The entire cohesion of the American society. Professor Bradley says we have to defend this or that, not because it's Catholic, but because it is true. And now I'm coming to the central concept which unites all these pieces which are translated in this book. From a short but very powerful introduction into the problematic of the so-called not only by the friends, but also by the opponents of this new natural law theory. Professor Bradley writes once, the innovators are conservative in results, but very innovative in the intellectual foundation. Then there is a piece which we do not, a piece from the art which we do not use to practice so much in Romania. It is a polemic rejoinder to a critics. Then we have not less, but very elaborated, not less polemical, but very elaborated positions expressed to central problems of the American society, which are to be translated in legal terms and precisely in natural legal terms. And I'm approaching, I think, the end of my intervention. I wondered, the end, what could be the image which I propose not to a definition. No one is entitled to define the work of another author, but an imagine to stimulate a discussion. And I was very struck from, the idea was suggested to me from the title of one book which Professor Predel co-edited, 1995, Catholicism, Liberalism and Communitarism, about the American intellectual tradition. And I was thinking, and then I was trying to verify my intuition. I was thinking, but instinctively, on Juan Donoso Cortés, Marquis de Valdegama, and his essay on Catholicism, liberalism, and socialism. And it was the same situation. It was a country, Spain, and a world, named a world which were Western Europe, which was in the middle of an existential crisis. The solution of Donoso Cortés now is perhaps not so important. Important is the radicality with which Donoso Cortés then and Professor Bradley now are making everything to depend on the cognition, recognition, and practicing cognition and recognition of truth in our societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abrigiano. And now the word to our esteemed guests. So now we should find out directly what the authors meant when they wrote what they have written, hopefully. And I will start with Professor Douglas Rasmussen, because he already came here, so he's no, you, the other, okay, sorry, my list had you on top of it. To Dr. Douglas Daniel to explain something about their philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you, and we want to thank everyone who put this event together and published this book. It's really a great honor for us, and we're hoping that this will begin making the Institute a worldwide center for intellectual pursuits in natural law and natural rights. I think that's something we hope for, exactly. So with two authors, we have to divide our work up, and so basically I'm going to present some things we jotted down about the similarities between Professor Bradley and ourselves, and then Doug will sort of elaborate on some of that and point out a few differences. So we have about 8 points here, I think, of similarities. So both Professor Bradley and ourselves can be positioned in the natural law tradition, broadly defined. The differences we'll talk a bit about, perhaps, but the main similarity is the idea of a grounded measure of the good rooted in nature that defines an objective good for human beings. So that's a mouthful, but that's basically what we agree on. This is followed by the fact that both of us are in the natural law Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, where am I here? A particular subject matter, because the center of the subject matter is human nature, so we're there. In our case, we hold that it's undeniably the nature of individual human beings that provides the standard or measure of determining morality and a worthwhile life. This is the ultimate sense of law, not commands, not conventions, not practices. And it's the nature of human beings and the moral life that provides the ultimate basis for natural rights. Individual human beings have the basic negative natural right to life, liberty, and property, and it is these rights that grounds the foundations for differentiating liberty from license, which I'll say more about in a moment. Further, Professor Bradley and ourselves are perfectionists in ethics, in the sense that we project an end that we work towards and fulfill. It's not that we argue for perfect human beings, but we argue for a process that is the basis of what an ethical and flourishing life is about. And this, in our case, comes down to individual action as well. Both Professor Bradley and ourselves agree that practical wisdom should be the masthead for ethical action. This does not exclude sentiment, emotion, intuition, desire, and the like, but is exercised with the oversight of the practical wisdom guiding each of these dispositions. And and both Professor Bradley and us ourselves agree that political life is not the grounding of or substitute for ethical life. Politics is both distinct from and limited by ethical considerations. We both agree that the protection of liberty is an important dimension of politics. Both Professor Bradley and us ourselves agree that politics needs ethical legitimacy. And then finally, I think, both Professor Bradley and us agree that the politics must grapple with integrated diversities. For our own part, the emphasis we place in politics is upon liberty. We think liberty is a moralized notion. It's not causality. It's not unimpeded motion. It is a moralized notion. It follows the Lockean tradition of natural rights, of which Doug may say more about in a moment. But this tradition argues that natural rights exist prior to convention. They stem from human nature and are not situated in particular places or particular peoples, but are part of, flow from the human nature themselves and serve as a ground for developing a political order. So with that, I'll turn it over to Doug.
I'm going to say a few things about our understanding and approach to liberalism because it is different from most. Although other values have been added to contemporary liberalism, such as equality, liberalism has, for the most part, been viewed as the political philosophy that holds that liberty is the paramount value or end for the state, or more generally, the political legal order. However, there are at least three meanings of liberty. The first is our natural capacity to focus on our conceptual capacity on understanding our surroundings and directing our actions, which is the human capacity for self-direction. The second is conducting our lives so that we are not controlled by ignorance or vice. That is, we are living in a flourishing or virtuous manner. And third, it is that relations among people in society are ordered in such a way that people are not subject to the initiation of physical compulsion. Thank you. Physical compulsion and coercion, or the threat thereof in its various forms. To be exact, a society that is governed by a political legal order in this way is one in which one's basic negative natural rights to life, liberty, and property are protected. I'll simply call that locution individual rights. So it's the third sense of liberty that is the primary concern of liberalism, and that involves an account of rights. There is, however, nothing about the third sense of liberty that precludes the other two meanings of liberty. Now, crucial to our approach to liberalism are the contentions. One, that liberalism is not a comprehensive worldview. That is to say, it does not offer a metaphysics, a view of human nature, an ethics, or even a social philosophy, but is instead a political philosophy. And two, that liberalism is both defensible and capable of being enriched by intellectual traditions other than the ones usually brought to it. Our defense of liberalism, then, is a defense in terms not usually associated with liberal teachings, which is to say we really have no desire to try to understand what John Locke really meant by nature, and we certainly do not subscribe to state of nature or any atomistic conception of human beings. Rather, we are working in a neo-Aristotelian tradition. But the word neo-Aristotelian must be understood as involving the prefix neo. So, for example, when Aristotle says that human beings are political animals. We're only a beast or god. We live outside the polis. We must understand that the word polis for Aristotle sometimes meant society and sometimes meant the state. And Aristotle wasn't too careful about when he was talking about one or the other. And in fact, it's not even clear that there was much of a distinction. We, however, do make a strong distinction between that. If you want to take a very good look at a very good book on this entire subject matter, read Professor Fred Miller's Nature, Justice, and Rights in Aristotle's Politics. It's a monumental work on Aristotle's politics, and it has a nice point on that. That being said, then, I want to say something more about the approach to political philosophy that makes liberalism important. And here what I want to do is I want to consider the question of the ethical legitimacy of a political legal order. There are, I think, two basic questions here. One, is there a connection between the ethical order and the political legal order? And two, if so, what is the nature of the connection? Now, if there's no ethical basis for a society's political legal order, then there is no reason why one ought to obey such an order. One may obey out of convention, custom, practice, or fear, but without a connection to the ethical order, there is no ethical legitimacy. There is no right to which might ought to be subordinated. Yet, even if it is simply granted that there is some connection between the two orders, in effect, between positive law and the natural moral law, it should not be assumed at the outset that the two orders are identical, or that even there's a direct or isomorphic connection between the two. In other words, we cannot assume that political philosophy is simply ethics writ large. Now, a good way to illustrate this is to consider some statements. Here is statement one. Doing X is right or good, or you could say wrong or bad, and ought to be done or ought not to be done. Statement one. Statement two, doing X ought to be politically, legally required or prohibited. Notice that statement one is not semantically equivalent to statement two. And further, the truth of statement one does not by itself imply statement two. To put it in simple Aristotelian logic terms, a middle term is needed to go from statement one to statement two. So, before making any pronouncements, then, as to what ought to be a law, it is incumbent on the political philosopher to show what justifies moving from the ethical order to the political legal order, or vice versa. Merely showing that some state of affairs is good, right, just, and ought to be done, or bad, wrong, and unjust, and ought not to be done, does not suffice to make it a concern of the political legal order. And here I would remind those people that pay attention to Aquinas, Joseph Pieper's observation that Aquinas suggests that there's a difference between demands of justice that are morally binding and demands of justice that are morally and legally binding. And so what interests us is how do you move from one order to the other? That, we would contend, is the primary question that political philosophers have to address, and it is something quite often that is just ignored. In fact, to be blunt about it, lots of pronouncements in political philosophy strike me as simply one non sequitur after another. That being said, however, then we need to say something more about liberalism. Liberalism, as we hold it and defend it, holds that individual rights are the middle term, and they do so because they address the political problem of integrated diversity. Now, we call the political problem of integrated diversity, we also call it at times liberalism's problem, because liberalism has been, by and large, the only political tradition to address the problem of integrated diversity. Nonetheless, the problem of integrated diversity results not from assuming a liberal approach, but from the very character of the self-perfecting or flourishing life. In our account of human flourishing and self-perfection, we characterize the human good in terms of 6 very general features. Now, these features are interdependent and interpenetrating. Their 6 features are, and I won't go into them in detail, but I'll just mention them. Human good is something real, something objective. It's not merely an attitude, it's not merely a construction, it's a type of reality. Secondly, human good is inclusive. It's not a single dominant good, but it is the most final end because it includes all other final ends. It is constituted by many things that are worthwhile, usually called basic goods or generic goods. Thirdly, human flourishing or human good is something that is individualized. Human beings are more than mere loci in which human goods are instantiated. Individuals actually, the character, the identity of the person actually helps to give reality to what we abstractly call generic goods. For example, generic goods like friendship or knowledge. Those goods don't exist generically or abstractly. They always have to be made determinate and real. That's where the individualization is crucial. Fourthly, human good is something that is not impersonal. Human good that is something always related to some person or other. It is always the good for or some individual person. It is related to a person. It's not related to what a person wants or thinks or that. It's not just a matter of opinion, but it's a matter of not only what we are, but who we are. So this agent relativity is an important notion. This is important, however, not to confuse it with just plain ethical relativism, which it's not. The fifth point is that human flourishing or human good is something that we do. It is a do-it-yourself job. It is a self-directed activity. That's not something that happens to us. It's something that we initiate, both in terms of understanding the good, in terms of achieving the good, in terms of maintaining the good, and indeed in terms of enjoying the good. And this has to be done in a way that is compatible with one another. This leads us to the sixth point, and this is that human beings are relational beings. Human beings are not isolated atoms. We do not exist on our own apart from family. Or if you look at the discussion of friendship, friendship is a central part of the human good. It involves friendships of pleasure, friendships of utility, and also what Aristotle called friendships of character or virtue. And so we are always already involved in society. Very few of us are raised by wolves. Well, I'll recall, I'm the same. Anyway, so it's important to understand that we are social. But to say that we are social or relational does not mean that we are merely nodes in some network of relations. To be, as a good Aristotelian, relations are secondary to substances. And so we are, of course, first things and relations flow out of that. But we are responsible for the types of relations we create. Relationships to others, relationships to things in the world that we make, etc. Now, all of these things about human flourishing give rise to what I call the problem of integrated diversity. And our contention is that in handling the political problem of integrated diversity, we have to endorse the notion of individual rights. What is the problem of integrated diversity? That, ladies and gentlemen, you'll have to wait on for the discussion.
I'll pass the mic now to Professor Bradley to express his views.
Thank you very much. I'm not wearing a watch, but it's probably been about an hour since our main host, Dr. Rizzio, expressed a kind of wry appreciation for the Americans. I think he said that the Americans have finally landed. I think he was chiding us for not getting here earlier, and I don't have much to say about that, but I do have an excuse. I wasn't invited to Romania until just a few months ago, so don't blame me. I took the first invitation I ever got to come to Bucharest, and I am an American, native New Yorker, lived there until I was 30 years old. And I confess that this American was feeling quite lost yesterday when he landed at Bucharest airport. Boy, that was a mistake. Theodora and Robert were delayed a bit in traffic, so I was standing around the lobby of your airport looking lost and probably kind of stupid, not knowing anything about Romania, not understanding a word of Romanian spoken, and even 3 years of high school French wasn't lighting up any of the written words in Romanian, which I was half counting on happening. So I was feeling quite displaced, but I was standing there in the lobby, and I happened to just look up at that precise moment, and I felt comfortably at home. And that's not because anybody was being nice to me, because they were ignoring me. But I looked out the window, and there I could see the Statue of Liberty and the Empire State Building and the Manhattan Casino being advertised right across the way. And then I looked down, and right at hand was an advertisement for Domino's Pizza. And I said, baby, I'm home. Well, then I got in the car, and I felt even more at home because we hit a lot of traffic, and that reminded me of my native New York. But then we drove through, I got into the older part of town, and I looked around and I said, graffiti, you know, that impromptu, creative, colorful art that's all over your buildings. Well, that's etched in my memory of a childhood misspent in Brooklyn and Manhattan. So I'm very pleased to be here, and I have to say in all seriousness that everyone from top to bottom, Paul, the other people in this institution, Theodora, Robert, made me feel very welcome. And I have to say I'm glad for this opportunity to be on this panel with I'll call them the two Dougs. And I was aware of their work before this occasion came onto my radar screen. But this occasion, you know, gave me the reason, or was the occasion to take a much more careful look at their work than I previously had. And I have taken a more careful look at their work, and I'm really much better off for doing that. And I have to say, this is playing against type, I suppose. I'm really quite humbled by the entire thing, for people here to take what I've written seriously enough to think it's worth translating into Romanian, and have someone as careful as Dr. Avarigno to write the foreword. And honestly, he looked into my work more seriously than I think I was when I wrote it. But, and I must say, it may have made you a bit nervous to lecture in English for the first time in a while, but you made yourself quite clear. And I have to say, your English is a lot better than my Romanian, so there's no need to apologize. But especially to Paul, my immediate host, I guess you would say, I'm grateful for this invitation. And I think it's very important, or I should say first, he's the perfect person to lead this important new center, the Center for Natural Law Studies and Normative Analysis. Paul's breadth of philosophical learning, as well as the depth of it, is most impressive. What I'll call his bicontinentalism is a real asset for this particular task. That is, his work in America, especially at George Mason, and his work here. He's renowned on both sides of the Atlantic. His energy and dedication to the cause. And also, I think, I'm not sure which is the adjective and which is the noun, but he's a very economically literate philosopher, which I think is the right way to put it. But he's at least a very philosophically sophisticated economist, or both. And I think given what he's trying to do with the center, those traits are essential and welcome. And I think that this, despite the chaos on the ground, not least in American politics, where just earlier this week we managed to fire the Speaker of the House of Representatives, something that doesn't happen often, although many speakers have deserved to be fired. But I don't think it's happened in over 100 years. And we're looking at an election next year where I think the odds are very likely in favor of the following lineup. One man who has perfected the art of narcissism and is facing 4 indictments in different jurisdictions is going to run as a candidate against an 80-something Democrat, Joe Biden, who has to be awakened, I think, most evenings to see if he has a mental pulse. But that'll be the lineup next year. But notwithstanding all the chaos in American politics, I think this is just the right moment for this center. And let me give you 3 reasons why I think so. and then we can turn to the discussion. And I will put off until the discussion time my own thoughts about where the two Dougs and I are simpatico, and where those few points are that we have some differences. I think we'll get to that shortly. So I don't mean to neglect the thoughtful interventions that you heard from them a few minutes ago. But three reasons why I think this center is essential now, and why it's so good that this institution, the University of Bucharest, is willing and has invested in it. Okay, one, in jurisprudence, and I use that term as a synonym for legal philosophy, legal theory. I think the set piece, the classic arguments, you might say battles, between positivism and natural law, which raged, if arguments about that kind of thing can rage, in the mid-20th century, really up until the end of the 20th century. The protagonists in jurisprudence were mostly Englishmen, or at least working in universities in the UK. But the great titan of positivism, of course, was H.L.A. Hart. His interlocutors, natural lawyers of a sort, Lon Fuller, H. Devlin. But I think that set-piece battle is pretty much over. I think we're all in jurisprudence, natural lawyers now. I don't think there's much left in positivism, in a sound positivism, that natural lawyers don't accept. And I don't think positivism, what's left of it after the natural lawyers accept what's sound in positivism, I don't think there's that much left of positivism to worry about. So all too briefly, just two explanations. One is that I think natural lawyers have rightly accepted what the positivists, maybe their central contention was the sources thesis for identifying law. You couldn't tell, positivists held, what was law in a given legal system except by identifying its pedigree, that it's law because of its source, in a legitimate lawmaking source, and that you don't introduce moral evaluative criteria when you try to figure out what the law is in the system. Now, natural lawyers should always have accepted that as having an important, if not overriding value, so that law in any given system is identified by reference to the sources of law in that system, which can usually be identified by and through the Constitution, to some extent through custom. So natural lawyers buy that. And the other thing I think that's happened that's worth mentioning is the sticking point for positivists in natural law theories of law, or one of them, again, was this introduction of moral evaluative judgments into legal analysis. But it was the emblem of it, or the banner, was the Thomistic and Augustinian assertion. An unjust law is no law at all. Now that went down very hard. Indeed, the positivists would choke on that, and they did. Now, I think jurisprudence over the last 20, 30, 40 years have clarified the proper meaning of that term and have recognized that an immoral, that is unjust law, lacks something essential to law. And indeed, an immoral or unjust law is not binding in conscience the way a just law is. But there's no good point served, according to the better view, I think, of natural lawyers, no good point served by denying the intra-systemic existence and validity of laws that are indubitably duly enacted and recognized in the system as valid. I don't think there's any good point served by saying it's not a law. So to take an example that tells you something about my own convictions about abortion, the Supreme Court in our country 2 years ago, a year plus ago, overturned Roe versus Wade, which is the case from '73 that created a right to abortion. Now, that was never a decision that was just, in my opinion, but I had no doubt that it was the law. In fact, I've taught constitutional law for 40 years, and I would teach Roe versus Wade every year. And I would never teach it to students for 40 years as somebody's theory or the hypothesis of the Supreme Court, but you would teach it as the law governing abortion, at least in the federal courts. And there's no good point to saying with Thomas or Augustine, oh, but it's no law at all. No. Second, within liberalism, within a big tent of liberalism, I think we're at a point where the what I would call anti-perfectionist liberalisms, exemplified most importantly by John Rawls' work, Theory of Justice. I think their day has passed. I'm not talking about the passing of liberalism, far from it, nor should we welcome the demise of liberalism, but rather the kinds of liberalism that are now in play as matters of political theory, or maybe a better term would be political morality, or political meta-morality, or perfectionist liberalisms. Anti-perfectionist liberalism, think of Rawls, had the view or maintained that the way to protect the liberty of people to live their own lives was to impose upon the government a kind of veil of ignorance or a vow of agnosticism about true value. That's why that kind of liberalism was called anti-perfectionist. As the story goes, the government, in this view, Rawls, must remain scrupulously neutral about what the really genuinely good life well lived, human well-being or flourishing. The government should be neutral about that. And again, it was thought to be the way, by blocking the government's access to the truth about well-being, that, the story went, was the way to secure liberty for people and equality as well. Well, that's not in the game, I think, any longer. Now, there's a lot of varieties of perfectionist liberalism. And I think my colleagues to my right are devotees and developers and proprietors of one particular kind of perfectionist liberalism. And that's a body or family of ideas that should be taken very seriously. But I think that's a long-winded way, perhaps, of saying that at the root of liberalism now, at least the versions of liberalism that people take seriously, are natural law accounts of human well-being. What truly is good for people. And that can range from full-orbed, thomistic accounts of human good, all the way to much more spare accounts that probably find not much more than the raw act of choice as the paramount overriding value. Third, and lastly, I mean, everything about natural law, including Paul's Center, anything I've written about natural law, and I'm sure, I shouldn't say I'm sure that Doug and Doug would agree, but I think they would. Natural law theory, day in, day out, in season, out of season, every minute that it's on the stage, presupposes, implicitly affirms, if it does not explicitly affirm, as the Dougs did a few minutes ago, the reality of self-constitution through morally significant free choice. I think Doug Rasmussen used the word self-direction or the phrase self-direction. That's fine. I use the word self-constitution, but I think we do mean the same thing. But that reality, the reality of we make ourselves by our morally significant free choices, is a truth of metaphysics. It's part of our world. And without it, natural law is worthless, because natural law is about, as Doug said, what's right and what's wrong. Natural law is about rectitude in choosing. And if we don't choose, then talk about natural law is talk about a phantom. It's like talking about a unicorn, something that you can conceptualize but doesn't exist. And in our world, I think, to an extent that usually surprises me when I begin to focus on another scholar's writing, or I'm engaged in a conversation like the one we might be having in a short time about the reality of free choice. The twin specters of materialism, that we're all matter, not spirit, and determinism, that whatever we are, matter or spirit or both, we don't have free choice in ways that we can't fathom. And notwithstanding what we think are experiences of free choice, we don't have free choices, at least morally significant ones. I find the surprising thing to me is that the people that in a way I never suspected of being guilty of either materialism or determinism, when you get in a certain kind of conversation with them, you discover that they are guilty. Not yet as charged, but now going forward, beware. I think that, I don't know anything about your faculty, and I trust from what the few people I've met that you don't have this problem. But American law faculties are full of people who talk about freedom, but don't actually believe it exists.
Thank you. We think to ourselves as preaching freedom as freedom away from determinism. So behavioral economics is not yet within the walls of the law school here in Bucharest. But before starting the debate, we need to pay tribute to the ladies which made these translations possible. So I will give the floor now to Teodora Nikita and Elena Cristina Enoiu, the two persons we need to thank that we have the end product on the table. And whether the translation is often a labor, I think they achieved for sure work in Arendian terms, if not even action, by putting together this translation. Teodora, Elena, please.
Thank you for the floor. It is a great honor and pleasure for me to take part in this book launch today, and I would like to thank everyone who made this possible. And especially, I would like to thank the one person sitting next to me, Teodora. She is the one who introduced me 2 years ago to the Center for Natural Law Studies and Normative Analysis, and she is the one person who came up with the idea of translating this text. And I honestly could not have hoped for a better translator as my colleague and also as my friend, so thank you, Teodora. I would like to say also a few words about the translating process. Perhaps the biggest challenge we faced was the process of finding the right words when it comes to those with no equivalent in Romanian. And sometimes it was a difficult task to precisely express an idea without drifting apart from their original meaning, having in mind that our main task was to preserve the meaning of the source text. And so this process made our job more challenging, since we thought that our text should be equally complicated and equally understandable exactly as the writers planned it to be. Fortunately, we did not work independently on every text. In fact, we were constantly in touch with each other, and we managed to find a common ground in every situation. And I believe this is a great achievement for both of us. And secondly, I also believe our work was much easier because each of us tends to prioritize different aspects when we translate, because Teodora is more attentive to details, whereas my biggest concern is usually the bigger picture and the final version of the text. Now, about the book, when we translated this text, I was a third-year law student, and I have to say that from the first moment I read them, they felt like a breath of fresh air, because they gave me a deeper understanding of some of the concepts I was already studying in law school. And the most bold or inspiring ideas for me were the ones about individual rights. The idea that if individual rights are not protected, then there can be no human flourishing, or the idea that individual rights are absolutely essential to preserving the possibility that every individual human being might flourish. And so this definition of human flourishing in terms of individual rights relieves, from my point of view, the great responsibility law professionals have, since judges, lawyers, and prosecutors play a major role in ensuring that individual rights are respected. If we only think about judges, we know to all of our speeches. Thank you very much.
Hi. So first of all, I want to say that all the interventions were remarkable, and I'm very grateful to be able to speak after our guests. And I want to thank everyone who made this book launch possible, Professor Algica, Professor Stoica, Universul Juridic Publishing House, and Dr. Tudor Brigeanu and Mircea Dumitru for writing the forewords. I want to say that although it's been only 2 years since actually the activity of our center started, we already have more than 30 or 40 members, which shows like how important such an approach as the one of the center is for the contemporary society, and also that law students and lawyers in general are very interested in this kind of approach, and we are still growing. I want to say from the beginning that both the center and the books that are being launched today are very personal to me. On the one hand, because the book that I translated with Elena, who was very kind to me, by Professor Rasmussen and Denial, and the book that I'm going to speak a bit about because the translator is not here, so the book written by Professor Bradley, they represent real models for me for pursuing moral and intellectual life, so I'm very indebted for being able to get to know them. And on the other hand, there's a very personal stake here because my own research is at the junction between nature law and virtue ethics. And I think that these two traditions are usually marginalized because they propose a certain approach to philosophy, which is basically looking at the nature of things and looking at human nature in a very deep way. Then I want to say that I have been knowing Professor Rasmussen and Denial for 4 years now, and throughout this time we kept in touch and worked together. And this book is also a sign of my gratitude for everything they have done to me, and for their friendship, and for their contributions to philosophy, and for how kind they were with me all the time, having never-ending Zoom calls. And I think that their approach to metaphysics, to moral philosophy, and to political philosophy is literally a blow to everyone who reads it. And it was a blow to me when I discovered it. I kind of rethought everything that I knew up to that point. And I just want to say a few words about why I think the perspective of both Professor Rasmussen and Denial and of Professor Bradley is very unique. And maybe I can start by saying that we can imagine that a lot of people here maybe do not agree or do not know about metaphysical realism, about liberalism. Maybe they think that natural rights are not really meaningful, or that virtue ethics is very outdated. And yeah, maybe they just think that these ideas are not okay, are not right. And still, what can those who believe these things learn from the tradition that our authors are trying to actualize? And I think it's something that is perhaps going to sound weird. I would call it a sense of wonder and a certain openness to reality without the intention to master it or to gain knowledge about it in order to modify it. And I think this is the kind of attitude to philosophy and to knowledge in general that was considered by Aquinas and by Joseph Pieper and by other people from this tradition, that was considered the kind of attitude that we should have in trying to pursue knowledge. Is this presupposition that man is always more complex than any theory can tell. So he's also rational, but it's also spiritual. He has emotion, but he has also thoughts. It's pragmatic, but it's also capable of a lot of transcendent aims. And I think that this emphasis on nature, on discovering nature rather than constructing it, is what determines our authors to be so interdisciplinary in their approaches, because you've heard about political philosophy, metaphysics, moral philosophy, they deal with a lot of issues. But also they leave the necessary space for technical considerations, it's possible to introduce a lot of social sciences types of problems in their approach. They are not excluded. And as Elena was actually saying, when you're reading their kind of philosophy, you just feel like you're having a sort of a breath of fresh air, because it's a very sophisticated philosophy, and they are not trying to make a sort of pure science out of metaphysics or out of law or out of moral philosophy. They are not trying to reduce human dimensions to just technical knowledge. And in the end, maybe this can be turned into sort of a survival argument, because the kind of technical knowledge about human beings can be conceived by artificial intelligence as well. But I think that this kind of openness to the reality, to the bottomless reality, is our specific difference to to artificial intelligence, and I think that this is a side of a normative thinking and of natural law that is never taken so much into consideration by constructivists or pragmatists. That the fact that we are able to conceive these things may save us in the end, no matter how extreme that sounds. Two more things I want to say. That I think that Professor Bradley's work is very important because it comes from the perspective of a law professional and stands as an excellent example of how both natural law and virtue ethics are very applied traditions as well. So they're not just speculations about something that is called nature. And I think that when he's dealing with constitutional law, with historical legal cases, with the relationship between the church and the state, he's always very careful to make distinctions between the necessarily positivistic aspects of these issues that we find in concrete laws, but he's also very careful to give us an overall picture of society and what the common good is. And I think his work is a very remarkable proof of how law can be both formal and have substance. It shouldn't be just like a formal enterprise, but it can involve like a lot of things about what human beings care about. And I think that the two books are very complementary in this respect. They involve both theoretical thinking and very practical thinking. And finally, I don't want to finish my presentation without remarking the importance of these books for the Romanian context in particular. Due to the censorship of the communist regime, Romanian intellectuals and philosophers were obliged to specialize in the more technical disciplines of philosophy, like logics, philosophy of language, philosophy of science. And I think that this is one of the main reasons why many great Romanian translations emphasize rather analytical problems in the disciplines just mentioned, and there seems to be no concern for ethics or for metaphysics. And after the fall of communism, utilitarianism and Kantianism sort of took over. So this kind of neo-Aristotelian, neo-Thomistic approach was kind of ignored in Romania, even though, especially in the Second World War in Great Britain and in the United States, it was a tradition that was actualized in the sense of responding to challenges of like analytical philosophy, philosophy of science, philosophy of language. This is perhaps a reason why we don't have this kind of books until we didn't have this kind of books until now. But at the same time, it is worth reflecting on a remark that Constantin Noica made, that Romanian philosophers never seem to have taken a very serious interest in ethical thinking, be it theoretical or applied. And I think from my perspective, this is a sort of particularly rich approach from which we can start to concentrate on enlarging a very deep and moral and legal reflection in Romania, of course, properly adapted to our context, as Professor Algica was saying. So it's not just following the West, but it's basically adapting what is good and worthy in their tradition. And yeah, I'm confident that the work of our center is a significant supporter of this aspiration. Thank you.
Okay, and now let's start the dynamic part of our evening. Oh, yeah, we will start the debate with the intervention from Professor.
I'll be very, very short. Now, here's a couple of vexing issues and questions. And the first one is a follow-up on what Professor Bradley said. So let's suppose that we are not in 2023, but we are in 2523. And let's suppose further, because this is actually very plausible, as Professor Bradley said, that the vast majority of people are not going to believe in free will. People will buy more and more into what cognitive neuroscientists are saying about the connection between brains and actions. Then actually in our ontology, which is infused by science, we are not going to have any place for freedom and liberty. So what would liberalism would be about at that time? What are the foundations of ethics and of law if we don't believe in moral responsibility and freedom? And things are changing in metaphysics. They are not staying put. So that's the first worry. Personally, I am a firm believer in free will. And one suggestion that I got from these marvelous exchanges here is that maybe we have to go more and more with ethics without necessarily presupposing that there are some firm ontological foundations of ethics. You know very well Hilary Putnam's work in his latest days about ethics without ontology. And maybe that would be, I mean, I don't want to go fictionalist or instrumentalist about ethics. We work as if we were free. That would be fictionalist. But nevertheless, we have to be prepared with that, especially in law, because that's the key point. If judges and many other people who work in law are not going to believe in free will and freedom, it's not only liberalism which is in jeopardy, but our whole society. The next question, again very briefly. There is this marvelous work by Derek Parfit, the great ethicist, Oxford philosopher. And one thread in his extraordinary work is, to put it very bluntly, personal identity is overrated. Personal identity, DI, ego, is a concept that is very much overrated, especially in the Western tradition. This is why actually Parfit, quite accidentally, went more and more toward Buddhism. So, all this tradition, Neo-Aristotelian, Thomist, and so on and so forth, basically builds upon the idea that there are individuals, egos, and they have rights and everything else that comes after that. Now, if again, people are going to be more and more convinced that there is this relational perspective, which is the one that actually enjoyed it very much, we have to think how to balance our views about individual rights and all the other paraphernalia and this idea that Parfit is advocating very forcefully. So this is a couple of vexing issues, and I'm eager to find some answers from our distinguished guests.
Thank you so much. In the division of labor at this stage, I should be taking the floor as a sort of moderator of the next and last stage of the conversation. So I'm going, so Professor Dumitru has already anticipated what I wanted to put on the table as a starting point of this segment. But before that, let me preface my let's say, moderating initial point with a basic observation about the procedure. We started like probably 10 to 15 minutes later, so with your permission, we are going to extend 10 to 15 minutes a little bit the conversation, but we'll be in time. So this is, as all good events have a beginning, a middle, and an end, so things are under control in this respect, so don't be worried about that. Here, we are keeping track of things. But I think that the next stage of our conversation, of our event here, is very important, and Professor Mircea Dumitru has again set up the stage for this next segment in a wonderful way. In my own perspective, I wanted to emphasize the same issue, the problem, the challenge. Professor Dumitru has presented the challenge from the perspective of the kind of belief systems and ideas that we have or we may have into the future. And those beliefs that we'll have, or many people will share, would be a challenge to human freedom and a society which is based on freedom. So if we don't believe anymore in freedom of choice, we don't believe anymore in the nature of the individual, why should we care about a social order or a system which is supposed to defend freedom of choice and individualism, or the individual, which is basically a very rough definition of liberalism? So this is the angle which comes from the perspective of ideas. But when we are looking to the current challenges, we are also seeing challenges which are coming from, let's say, technology, from culture, from institutions. Look just at technology, how we are traced, and our decisions are targeted, and our freedom of choice is framed by the new technological structure, which is penetrating through digitalization everything. So we should be concerned about that. Now, and this is the stage where I like to put on the table, first of all, something very controversial, or might be controversial. Professor Mircea Dumitru has situated the point of crisis, the threshold, what, 200 years in the future, or 100 years in the future? 500 years in the future. Yes. I would say, currently we are talking, and in my initial remarks I was talking about a crisis. And people are talking about the current crisis of the Western civilization, and in general, a crisis of civilization. So my first question to the panelists would be, do you agree with this diagnosis, with this reading? Are we currently going through a crisis of Western civilization? And when answering this question, yes or no, if yes, are those people who are saying that actually the crisis of this civilization is the crisis of liberalism? Yes or no? Because in function of these questions, we'll see how your own approaches, the differences and the convergences between your approaches may help us to diagnose the nature of the crisis and to build up approaches to respond to that crisis. So we might see if there are ways in which you are converging with the diagnosis in your views, and this is to be debated here, right? And also we see if there are ways in which you are, as I said, converging, diverging. Convergence and divergence, what is common and what is not. But in order to make things interesting and relevant, right, we shouldn't be looking like we are talking scholastics speculations, philosophical speculations. Everything that has been discussed and which is on the table has extraordinary relevance for the ways we are going to respond to the crisis if the crisis exists, or to preempt the crisis if the crisis is not here at this point. And Professor Mircea Dumitru has set up in a very clear and intuitive way one of the directions of those challenges. So, briefly, do you think that the Western civilization is going through a crisis? And if yes, is that the crisis of liberalism or has a different nature?
Well, I think I'd say beware someone who comes to you and paints an apocalyptic picture of reality and then says, answer yes or no, briefly. That's hard. But I'm glad to do what I'm told to do. So let me say this much, and really, Professor Alajika and Dumitru have offered us a panorama of issues, and I think it's actually, I think, an almost apocalyptic scenario, full of issues. But I do think that we're living through a crisis of belief in morally significant free choice. There can't be a crisis about the existence of morally significant free choice, because it's a truth of reality. It's a metaphysical truth. It can't be wished away. So there is that reality. So people under the misimpression that they don't have free choice or don't care about it or it's not significant are almost certain not to flourish. They're going to live in a kind of degraded state. So that's one thing. I don't think the reality even can be escaped as a matter of experience. Let me put that differently. People experience life as full of free choices. Now, except when they're getting blamed for something, when they say, or being held responsible, they'll say, well, somebody else made me do it, or I couldn't help myself. But in general, I think we have the experience of free choice, and you have to be talked out of believing in free choice. And people, I think, can get talked out of it. But it's not easy to do that. So I think we have that, you might say, in our favor. But the threat to morally significant free choice that I see, at least in America, probably to some extent in the West generally, I'm not sure about Romania, frankly, maybe. But the threat is not a kind of brutal determinism, I think, although some people are brutal determinists. It's rather the substitution for morally significant free choice of a kind of counterfeit simulacrum of it, which is an unrestrained matter of free expression. So I think you see in America and probably in the West generally, people who believe it's very important to be free to be themselves and to express and articulate and present and identify as they individually see fit. So this has the look of freedom, and it can take the form of tattoos or purple hair or thinking you can be in the wrong body and changing your sex. But this actually is highly values a certain kind of what appears to be freedom. But it has nothing to do with morally significant free choice and deliberation and judgment, deciding about what to do when confronted with the prospect of choosing between or among real goods. So this kind of free expression, call it that, self-expressiveness, that we have, I think, is the sort of emerging cultural norm. And I consider that a crisis for belief in and presupposing going forward morally significant free choice. Thank you.
Yes, very much in agreement with what you had to say. We need to consider, and this gets involved, what it is that crisis means, what it is that danger or bad or good mean, or what even rational means if there's no such thing as free choice. In a real sense, if there's no such thing as free choice or no such thing as self-direction, there's nothing to worry about, guys, because we got no control. It's, you know, a waste of time. Is there a crisis of Western civilization, and is it a crisis of liberalism? I don't see it in ontological terms as I see it so much as the supposition on the part of too many folks that there is no basis for what is good or bad, right or wrong, that we are all in the grips of a huge theory that's false, to mention John Mackey, or just to talk about non-cognitivism. You remember that when Hitler was beginning to take over parts of Germany and World War II was beckoning, the central book in Britain in philosophy was A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth, and Logic. And what did the word good mean? Hooray. What did the word bad mean? Boo. That's it. So say that when you look at Dachau and Auschwitz, etc. Boo, hooray, that's just it. That cannot be a way in which people can live their lives, nor can it be a way in which civilization can do that. Moreover, it seems very important to us to emphasize what Locke said, that liberty is not license, that we don't understand what political liberty is if we just think of it as doing whatever you damn well want to do. It's got to have some kind of moral basis, and that's why we think the concept of rights is valuable. But now let me speculate a little bit more on something, and this is, I think, in part from what Professor Dumitru said. That is, what if what we do and what if our thinking is just a brain state? Or what if we're stuck in just sort of a material, mechanistic account of things? To make an old Thomistic point, whether this is completely historically accurate or not, I'm not going to try to determine. But this, I think, presupposes what we understand to be a Cartesian starting point, that a human being is either a ghost or a machine, that there's a type of substance dualism, and the mind works apart from the body, or the body works apart from the mind, and somehow we have to figure out how they relate, and we end up jumping into one side of it, which is where everything's all mental, or where everything's all physical. I'll also remind you that Descartes ended up thinking that animals were just machines, and there was nothing about life, there was no teleology in the world. I think those assumptions still permeate our view of science, even with the advent of relativity and the changing views of science. I think our approach to ontology is not scientific, but scientistic, in that we don't let empirical reality play a role. We think of empirical reality as just confined to a set of sense data, rather than a knowledge of things. So there are a lot of issues here. So one of the things I would want to do is I would want to call for a more thorough philosophical and scientific examination of the ontological foundations and presuppositions behind the claim that we're going to be reduced to just a brain or a brain in a vat. But I understand, what was it, Zager and Evans, in the year 3535, man is still alive, you know, all we are is dust in the wind, etc. I mean, that sort of picture of human beings is I think, just mistaken. And I don't think science shows that, and I don't think a good ontology must show that either. But that's a big debate, no doubt about it.
Thank you.
Well, I certainly agree with both my colleagues here, so I'll just sort of add some side comments. First of all, we don't need to go to 2500 to get the answer, because the 20th century is filled with compatible lists. And basically, a compatible list is some... But you might be a different one. Most of the ones I know actually don't think there's free will, but it's too complicated to figure out what's going on, so we say, well, there's no free will, but we're just going to work on the normal things anyway. I don't know if you're that type of compatibilist or not. It didn't sound like it to me. So that's one thing. So that's been going on quite a while, and we can look around us and see the benefits that that's produced in ethics to the boo-hooray theory and other sorts of constructivism that I think we oppose. So we do want to have an ontology foundation for what we're doing, and that's what we're trying to find a way to instill that in the face of 20th century ethical theory, which pretty much we oppose in many dimensions. Personal identity is interesting, but blue hair and tattoos strike me as marginal, personal identity at the margins, not at the core. And I think that's where we need to work. It's fine with me if you want to have blue hair and tattoos, but I don't think that shows that you have a sense of personal identity at all. In fact, many of those people are followers, not leaders in that regard. So we need to think more carefully about what personal identity means. And it is true that we've been trapped by those kinds of things, as thinking of, but there may be a difference between personal identity and personal expression, and maybe that's one way to handle the issue. On the crisis of Western civilization, liberalism is called to answer in some ways what's been going on. But let's say there is this crisis. Well, that does pose a problem for liberalism. How did we get there from liberal orders that did exist in some countries? And so the examination of the nature of liberalism, whether we really moved away from liberalism in the 19th century, like I think we did, from a true liberalism to a false liberalism, that's my opinion, but we need to examine the nature of liberalism more carefully, which is part of what I think all three of us and other people here in this room are trying to do. So those would be my responses to those three questions.
Thank you, Doug. So again, you're already anticipating the questions and the direction of the conversation, and you have anticipating in two ways. First of all, I think that we are getting to the stage where we're trying to understand better the differences between your views. But we want to do that in the context of this discussion about liberalism. And why liberalism is important, because in a sense, whatever views we have about human nature, about society, about law, sooner or later we have to create institutional structures, policies, designed based on an understanding and some principles. And if those principles are wrong or are in crisis, or now we have a situation of a false liberalism, which is in crisis, as opposed to the true liberalism, we need to determine that. And my question is, how do we determine that based on your views? What are the differences between the diagnosis of the problem of liberalism, the nature of liberalism, and the applications of liberalism to the current circumstances? So I think that in this conversation, as we get closer to the end, we have seen a lot of convergence between you. So I think at this stage, maybe it would be good to outline the specificities of your view, not so much as a sort of cohesive, coherent family, but as differences between that family of perspectives. It might make a difference for the ways we are understanding the nature of the crisis and the solutions of those crises. So yes, Doug, yes.
Well, if we're talking about possible differences, let me just raise one. Doug and I had mentioned it before. Professor Bradley has suggested that we're perfectionists in politics. The subtitle of our book, Norms of Liberty, goes Perfectionist Ethics with a Non-Perfectionist Politics. And that raises some interesting questions about what we're meaning by perfectionism and its role in politics. We may, and it seems in some of the things we've read of your pieces, differ to some extent about the state's role in I won't say enforcing morality, but encouraging morality is maybe a softer way to go. And we need to discuss that. But I think we think of ourselves as non-perfectionists in politics, but not Rawlsian neutralists, because in our case, it does have an ethical foundation. The ethics that we're dealing with is true. It isn't some sort of veil of ignorance and we just come to some agreement and then neutralize ourselves that way. No, there is some objectivity to it. There, I think we're on solid ground, and maybe we debate from that point of view, I don't know. But I just wanted to suggest that we need to explore what it means to have non-perfectionist politics or neutral politics.
Yeah, I'd add just a little bit more. I have a brother, interestingly enough, who is a committed communist, a labor theory of value advocate, no less. Very smart man, and interesting conversation to have with him. And he always tells me that everything is political. Now, I don't mean in the sense of social. I mean, he means political. In a good, I'll say, Marxian way. Yeah. And in a sense, I think all of us, Professor Bradley, Dr. Denial, and myself, want to say that not everything is political. We want to say that there is a role for all sorts of institutions, all sorts of groups, all sorts of organizations that are interested in trying to attain and help people attain a worthwhile human life. We need, Doug and I would argue, a regime that is concerned with protecting basic individual rights, because we want to allow people the freedom to associate or disassociate in order to form organizations that will promote certain values. Now, if you read someone like Edmund Burke, he talks about the development of little platoons in society, something that's in between the individual and the state. Tocqueville's Democracy in America talks about all sorts of groups and things that people organize and make. And these are ways in which people try to aid people, encourage people, assist people in attaining a worthwhile life. I think I have the name, correct me if I'm wrong, Newhouse? Richard Newhouse wrote an essay, early 1980s, I believe, on the naked public square, I believe he called it. And he said that we need to have some kind of cultural forces at work. And I'm not smart enough or knowledgeable enough to know what those forces are. Newhouse, I think he argued certainly that maybe the institutions of the church, maybe forms of Christianity. I'm not going to try to get into the details of that. But we might need more institutions like that at work to help create a solidarity among us so people don't feel it's like they live in a Nietzschean universe. You want to see a picture of the Nietzschean universe? Watch the TV show Yellowstone. Okay? It's all power, it's all pleasure, it's all pain. You don't need to be just a brain. You're just pushed and pulled. People watch that stuff. They identify with that. They think that way. There needs to be a concern for developing institutions that will teach people otherwise. The big point I'm making is that not everything is political. That's not a function of the state, it's a function of us as individuals and as social beings and as people that create institutions. And we need to create those institutions. Liberty is the context for creating that institution because it gives you the maximum way of trying on different ways of doing it. Once you try to set it up and determine what institutions are going to be favored and what institutions are not, then you're going to create a world where you end up, what should I say, getting rid of the House of Representatives Speaker. That's a world we move to. But it's, we need to understand that liberalism properly construed is an argument against saying that everything is political.
Thank you, Professor Bradley. And for the audience, you see that I'm trying to set these gentlemen to disagree with each other, and it looks like that they are converging again and again on the same gravity, intellectual gravity point. So let me try again. Bradley, please.
Well, I do disagree with Doug Rasmussen. He's been delicate enough not to mention it, but he's an avid New York Yankees fan. I hate the Yankees. I'm from New York City, and the Yankees were the aristocracy, and I'm from a blue-collar family, so take that, Doug. But in the interest of time and getting more people to participate, even audience questions, if we have time, I'll just offer a few bullet points in response, and I think I'll indicate some areas of disagreement. I mean, certainly, maybe it's a Lockean position, as a philosophical position. I guess there are different views of Locke, but one view, I don't know if it's mine, I think it is that Locke thought that virtue really existed in the society, and that the institutions and practices within the society were where you would look to sort of promote virtue and to assist people to perfect themselves. And the state, especially the state's coercive authority, would be kept to a sort of bare minimum, maintaining conditions of peace and justice. Now that certainly can be a recipe for a flourishing society if the different parts of the society are in place. But I think that's a contingent matter. I don't know enough about Romanian history. I know a little bit about Polish history, but there clearly have been many societies in our history of humankind, in which you didn't need the government, the Tsar, the king, or even the parliament to do very much for there to be on the ground the kinds of conditions, practices, relationships, and associations that people needed to flourish. But there have been a lot of situations where that's not the case. The state could set out to destroy some of those, or some of those institutions, associations, and practices could atrophy in a degraded culture, a corrupted culture, in which the state could possibly have a role, non-coercive, but nonetheless actively promoting the resurrection or restoration of these institutions. So my judgment, and here's a disagreement, I think, Doug and Doug are making a philosophical case for, I'll just call it something and not to pick a quarrel about what to call it, for a modest, if not night watchman state. As a matter of philosophical reasoning, and my view would be that that's actually not a matter that philosophy can settle, that it's more of a contingent historical question. You're going to get liberty in any society that really, really believes in self-constitution through free choice. That society will have to commit itself to individual, and for that matter, group freedom. But as to what the state can usefully do to help that project happen, that is, promote conditions conducive to human flourishing, I think that's a variable matter and not so much a matter of philosophical reasoning to a conclusion that in some important sense is philosophical and thus timeless and constant and universalizable. Now, I happen to think that in America, we're at a point where what I'm calling the Lockean recipe is simply unavailable. I think we in America live in a corrosive, corrupted post-Christian culture. And while the state's coercive authority is not much of the answer or solution to that problem, I think there's much that a healthy public authority, guided by an understanding of the complexity and diversity of human goods and the role of human freedom in realizing those goods, could play through its non-coercive authority, especially its funding authority, could play a more active role to promote the realization of human good than I think Doug and Doug would allow or think is wise or prudent And maybe they would even go so far as to say, no, that would actually call for the state to do something that as a matter of principle is wrong.
Thank you. Doug and Doug, you have the chance now to respond and also to make the point about the limits, put it this way, of Jerry's position. And then I think that will open up to questions from the public.
Well, I'm not sure who's more idealistic here, you or us, in the sense of finding that state that doesn't abuse its power in moving us towards some sort of virtue. We're influenced by public choice a bit, and that whole way of looking at the state and the incentives. The state's involved in so much now. I'm not any more optimistic that your way of doing it is better than ours. We do have that disagreement between us, I think, on that score. But that just may be our pedigree in a way, is how we've come to this. I also want to say that both Doug and I are clearer in our books, I think, than perhaps we've been here, that we don't think everything can be solved from the armchair of the philosopher. So we put out these ideals, we do our philosophic work, but we have deep respect for the common law or things like the common law, traditions, etc., to help us sort out what it would mean to go to X and how we get there. But we don't spend much time on the practical stuff, and that's in a way by design, and also our belief that armchair philosophy can't solve everything. So Doug, I don't know what you want to add to that.
Yeah, I obviously concur. I said in my very first comments that I would get a chance to mention the political problem of integrated diversity. You'll remember that I provided an account of human flourishing that was objective, inclusive, individualized, agent, relative, self-directed, and social. Now, that characteristic of human flourishing creates a problem. And the problem can be specified as follows, and I'm going to read the problem, hopefully slowly enough. How is the appropriate political legal order, the order that provides the overall structure to the social political context, to be determined? What is its ethical basis? Since the structure provided by the political legal order will rule over all equally, how can the universalism of the political legal structural principles square with the pluralism and self-direction required for human flourishing? Hence, how is it possible to have an ethical basis for an overall or general social political context, a context that is open-ended or cosmopolitan, that will not require, as a matter of principle, that one form of human flourishing be preferred to another? How, in other words, can the possibility that various forms of human flourishing will not be in structural conflict, how will that be achieved? Or to put it more bluntly, how do you have a political legal order that doesn't practice moral cannibalism? In other words, you know that you're making an omelet and some eggs must be broken. Is it the case that the political legal order can do this? Appealing to human flourishing or human good as the answer to this question cannot be the answer, because human flourishing is not abstract, it's not impersonal, it's not something in our heads, it's something concrete and real that's achieved through the self-directed activities of individuals. We have to respect the realism of human flourishing, that it is determinate and concrete, and not Platonize it in order to provide an answer. Our answer is that we have to look to something that is common and peculiar in the concrete to every form of human flourishing, no matter how diverse it is. And when we end up, and there's a lot to this argument, and I can't go into the details here, but we end up arguing that what is common and peculiar to every concrete form is the exercise of one's self-direction. Because the exercise of self-direction is consistent with the diversity of human flourishing, because it is not concerned with the object of self-direction, but with the exercise. To put it another way, What we're doing is we're understanding that moral norms are not all of one type, or they don't all have the same function. There are some moral norms that are concerned with establishing the condition for the possibility of the exercise of moral responsibility. And there are also moral norms that are concerned with helping us exercise that moral responsibility in a right way. So what we're saying very much is there's a difference between the type of principle we're looking for and the type of principle we find in ethics. Think of it this way. You play a strange game over here in Europe. I think you call it football. We would call it soccer. There are rules for playing soccer. You cannot pick up the ball and run with it. Correct? That's not playing soccer. But if I'm a soccer player and I know how to fake one way, I kick the ball over to my partner, I fake this way, I go around the opponent, and he kicks the ball back to me. I give and go, so to speak. That's playing the game well. There are norms for playing football well, and there are norms for playing football. The answer to the question of integrated political diversity is that we need to protect the possibility of self-direction because we want to make the practice of the moral game possible. We're not concerned with whether you're choosing rightly or wrongly. We just want to establish the possibility for that occurring. Whether you do it or not is another issue. This is not to say that the political end replaces the ethical end. You still have the responsibility of finding a worthwhile life. We still have the responsibility of trying to create a society that's worthwhile. But we're simply saying that's not the aim of the state or the political legal order, because ultimately when it comes down to a law, law requires and orders, it requires threats, it requires compulsion. Don't follow a law sometime. Refuse to follow a law and see what the ultimate result is. Ultimately, there'll be someone knocking on your door. And indeed, there should be in some cases. But the point is, there's a difference between what a legal order calls for and what an ethical order calls for. They're certainly relatable, but they're different. And I think that's an important point that we want to emphasize. So that's a brief response to the question of our differences. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So again, as I have mentioned, we are getting closer to the time dedicated to our conversation, but in the end, we'd like to open up for a discussion and questions from the public to the panelists. So please. Oh, it looks, I'm sorry, yeah. Yes, over there, yes.
Is it possible to preserve Christian identity in Europe and in the US while retaining religious liberty for everyone?
I'd be among the last in this room to opine about what it would take on the ground or what the world historical prospects are for Christianity's revival in Europe. About that, I would have to plead ignorance. But there's no reason in principle or nothing in the nature of Christianity, nor I think any compelling lesson from history that would suggest that it's impossible to do that. You can have a Christian society which respects the religious liberty of everybody. Indeed, I would argue that that's part and parcel of Christianity. It is certainly the vision that you see of religious liberty in the, I guess, the most important statement by the Roman Catholic Church on religious liberty in my lifetime, which is the Declaration on Religious Freedom from the Second Vatican Council. But in short, there's, in that short, relatively short document, you can see a strong affirmation of what you could call the Christian identity of a society, with the caveat that everyone has a right to immunity from coercion in matters religious. So religious liberty, Christian identity, I think can go together.
Thank you. I have one more
Okay, go. Hold. You want to hear the answer from the other panelists, or it's a immediate follow-up question? Let's listen to the other panelists, and then we get back to your second question.
I'll just quickly add that here's a quotation. Liberty is not a means to a higher political end. It is itself the highest political end. It is not for the sake of good public administration that it is the highest objects of civil society and private life, unquote. That's by Lord Acton, a classical liberal and a Roman Catholic.
Thank you. Please, the second question.
I think that's for Professor Robinson. Is there hope for a political, legal order that does not require that an individual or a group of individuals' well-being are given structured preference over another?
Could you please briefly restate for the public again the question?
She wants to know, is there any hope for the political ideal that we've offered? Is it something? It's in principle possible. I don't think it's impossible. But what's in principle and possible might not ever happen. As a matter of logic, you just have to admit that. I'm a philosopher. I'm not a political scientist or a historian or a sociologist. And so, I mean, I think it's possible. I think ideals are important, though, especially if you don't try to bring them about from the armchair, but you pay attention to what other disciplines have to offer. And I'm always amazed at what human beings can do if they believe in something and it strikes them as right and true. But, you know, do things look positive now to me? No, they do not. But I still hold on.
Let me just say that there are many pessimistic moments I go through about how things are going to turn out. But when I think of it also, there's been a lot of things that have happened, especially among the young. There are groups that have started forming to discuss these ideas that have grown exponentially over the decades. In philosophy, you mentioned you had translated Nozick. I mean, think of philosophy and liberalism before Nozick existed. It wasn't there. There was nothing. And now we have departments that are filled with libertarians. I think there was a point when Doug and I knew every libertarian in the United States personally, but that is all gone. So I don't want to despair too much. I think the answer comes in the people coming up and perhaps not in the people already in positions of power.
Thank you, Doug. Unfortunately, we have only one question left, given the time. As you know, we have promised to have a beginning, a middle, and an end of this conversation. We are getting very close to the end of the conversation, but we still have room for one more question. What? Yes, please. Please, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Good evening. Thank you so much for this wonderful evening. And this is an important moment for our project finally that we started 4 years ago with our center. I have a very short question. How do you see especially the individualism, the article related to individualism in the idea of the ethics? How do you consider that this could impact the idea of the ethics in business, and especially in the companies that have and they are researching these aspects from the perspective of the application of the principles of the ethics in business and ethics taking into consideration the behavior of the person of the companies.
Thank you. Yeah, please go ahead.
There was a time not so long ago when I thought all corporations were on our side of the issue, but that's all changed now, and in America, the corporations have gone what we call woke, and I don't know about this issue. I need to give, perhaps we need to give more thought to it, but I'm about to try to make sense of it. Why is this happening? And I don't have any really good theories, unfortunately, for you at the moment, but if I finish this paper, maybe I'll have something then.
Excellent question. One of the things I do now, I'm retired from St. John's University, and I'm affiliated scholar at the Institute for Economic Inquiry at Creighton University in the middle of the United States, a place called Omaha, Nebraska. And I do conferences on stakeholding versus stockholding and all the debates about that, both in the legal and the ethical and the political. And it is a question about, you know, what people ought to do and whether there are normative things that go into business actions. There's also the question of what kind of contractual responsibilities, for example, managers have to the shareholders, or fiduciary responsibility, and whether that's important. All of that is the case, but it is also the case, what Doug just said, is that some of these discussions are becoming sort of beside the point. And then I don't know whether this is literally true that Lenin said this, but Lenin is supposed to have said, the capitalists will sell us the rope with which we will hang him. And I'm not sure if I'm going to say something, it's probably embarrassing, but I'm not too confident in a lot of the moral stature of a lot of people in business. But for that matter, with the exception of all the people here, I'm not that confident about some of the people in academia either.
Well, lest we end on that less than cheerful note, especially the one about Lenin, I could offer one observation from the perspective of legal ethics, professional ethics in the United States. I think what we're seeing happen is perhaps what you would predict would happen if you have the breakdown of kind of rectitude among persons and a kind of flourishing of individualism in a profession. I don't think you see any kind of anarchy, quite the opposite. You just become more intensively rules-based. So the people in charge, whoever they happen to be, make more and more rules to govern the behavior of what are now conceptualized, not as upright people pursuing a noble calling, treating the law as their vocation, but rather a bunch of disparate people with unknown values who have to be kept on some kind of straight and narrow path. And that just results in fact, this isn't necessarily going to be the case, but in fact what's happened is you get the colonization of professional ethics by the most outspoken, and you might call them woke elements. So the people with the power to make the rules from the top down, no longer recognizing a kind of indigenous culture or moral ecology in the profession, believing that because everything is broken down to kind of individualism, we have to govern every move people make. Well, then that's a situation that's ripe for a hostile takeover by the most highly motivated, I guess, loudest voice in the room. And I think that is what's happening in legal ethics in America.
Thank you, Professor Bradley. So as you could see in the last segment of the conversation, actually the panelists have demonstrated why it's so important to engage in the kind of philosophical and legal theory investigations of the type that we have seen. These are the kind of pathologies and the elements which are defining the crisis that we're talking about. What is happening in corporations, what is happening in universities, what is happening in churches, in societies, in the West and increasingly in the rest of the world are the signals that something is going wrong at a very profound level. Now, people may agree or may disagree with the kind of approaches that we have illustrated here in this conversation. People may say that maybe a different approach is needed, a different framing. But fact is that something has to be done. A response has to be built up to these challenges. It looks like that the way things are going, very soon, another level in this escalation of the crisis will be reached. And the sooner people start to think and to explore these type of ideas, maybe criticize these ideas and come with better ideas, the closer we'd be to a point where we'll be able finally to respond to this crisis. I think at this point, unfortunately, we have to interrupt, to stop for a while. Our conversation will continue informally for a while. And hopefully in the structure and in the framework of the Center of the University of Bucharest, we'll be able to continue on the long run the interface and the investigations and the translations generated by this center. At this point, I'm going to say just that it was my privilege to be the moderator of this segment of the conversation, and again, to pass back to my colleague, Professor Rizoiu, the mic. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Aligica. And just in the closing session, let's say, I would say, as a professor of the course of legal status of persons, that corporations are only fictional persons. You know, in English they are called legal entities. Only the French call them personnes morales. But everybody knows that the French have nothing to do with the law. So basically they don't understand anything, at least in the law of corporations. So basically, if you are looking to the history of real corporation, East India Corporation, West India Corporation, morals was not in there, ethics was not in there, it was not their concern. Unfortunately, I think that the larger the structure is, the less ethical it will become. And it is not about the corporations themselves, it is the state. Our distinguished guest explained a lot of degradation in the state itself. Why? Because the individuals who are taking positions in the state, they forget they are civil servants in the first place. And they are just individuals without political goals. They are individuals only with personal goals. And I would even say that take a look to the most moral legal entity you can find, the church as an institution. Look at the scandals in the past half century around various churches, and you'll see that maybe at some point, if the individual responsibility is left aside, if you think that the responsibility is with the institution, with the organization, you might end up in a world where nobody is responsible. Like, you know, in the, I have another vision of an apocalyptic world than Professor Dumitru. I have the vision of William Gibson's cyberpunk universe, where corporations were driving the world around without any ethics and without any thinking of the right of the individuals. But this is for another day to explain. Now, if you want some signings on your books from the authors, it will be a privilege to have the authors here in Bucharest. We don't know, we hope we will extend you a permanent invitation, so we hope we will see you, but we hope you will have the occasion to sign other books in the next round. So for now, if you want to have the original signature of the authors, please come here and benefit of their physical presence, ethical presence, moral presence, whatever you want to say. Thank you very much.